just had a big lunch. Okay, good afternoon. A little bit better. All right. Well, thank you. Just lunch, right? Yeah, maybe not enough coffee after lunch. Well, thank you for coming here. I know lunchtime was quite short, so thank you for showing up for this talk. I'm quite excited to be here and to be speaking with you. Also, we have, 2 hours for this whole session, and definitely I'm not going to be speaking for 2 hours, right? Because I don't want you to fall asleep or leave before that. So we'll try to make it interactive. Okay? So at any time, if you have any questions or comments you want to make, or just raise your hand and I will stop at an opportune time and we'll take your questions and comments. There are also plenty of microphones here, right? So we can pass them around as needed, right, Natasha? One last thing, you might see me walking back and forth to my computer just to click because I forgot to bring my clicker. So I'll just be, and there's a ton of animation, so I'll be doing this regularly. So that's when I guess we're getting started. So what I want to talk about is now this whole topic of decarbonizing supply chains, and I want to share lessons from an actual work that we have done. Now, I'm an academic, and for many people that might sound like I just work in theory, but it is not. So I come from Asia School of Business, which is right here. It's a 7-minute walk from Sasana Kijan. It's a collaboration between Bank Negara, Malaysia, and MIT Sloan School of Management. We are a business school, but we also do a lot of action research. We actually work with companies, organizations, and so on, both formally through research projects, through funded projects, and so on, but also informally on our own time. And what I'll be sharing is some of my own experience, both I have done in Malaysia and I'm involved in, as well as some work that I did back in the US, and I was still at MIT. So my promise, hopefully, is that what I will share with you is an uncommon perspective. It's slightly different from what you may have heard. And the way I'm going to do that is we'll talk about why it is important, why decarbonizing supply chains. I won't spend much time on this because you already know a lot of this stuff. That's why you are here. Then we'll talk about what does it mean to pursue net zero. And specifically, what does success look like? What are we doing these days about net zero? And if you're not going full throttle on it, why not? What is stopping us from investing fully in net zero? And then we'll talk about a solution. We'll talk about what makes us what hampers the progress on net zero, and see what we can do about it. We'll share one solution, which is basically the challenges of the long term. And then after that, we'll talk about a second solution that I'm involved in. It's a Malaysian innovation that some of you might know, but if you don't, I'm happy to talk more about that. So that's just the introduction, and then we'll before that, why don't you sit down if you're actually speaking. Yeah, I feel bad that you're doing this. If you get tired, let me know. I can walk in back and forth. Okay, so let's talk about the context. So we had devastating floods about 2 or 3 years ago, right? In 2020, 2021, 2 years ago. At that time, it was the most number of people displaced by the floods. Okay, historic floods ever. Around the same time of the year before that, Australia had massive bushfires. This was the deadliest bushfire at that time in Australia. And the number of hectares burned is 18 million hectares. Just to give a context, Peninsular Malaysia is about 70% of that. So imagine the land equivalent of all of Peninsular Malaysia burning down, plus half as much. That's what happened in 2018, 2019 in Australia. And then, this was 2022, India and Pakistan, apologies for the typo, at the hottest March in subcontinent since 1990. Record temperatures recorded. Now, you have seen all of these events or heard about them. What is interesting about these is how they are described. So we call them once in a century disaster. And the problem is that this once-in-a-century disaster happens every year now. And that's the urgency. That's why we are here, right? That's why we want to do something about it. So if you look at some metrics, and maybe you can just bring them all up at the same time on the slide. Yeah. So what this shows, you probably have seen this data, is the temperature over 12 months. And the red lines are lines that trace the temperatures in the year 2022, 23, and 24. And you can see there is a clear trend. The Earth is getting hotter and hotter consistently over the years. You can see the surface temperatures in Malaysia on this panel, which is on the top right. But also, if you look at a different country, the country that has greater seasons, more seasonality in climate, than UK, I took just one example, you can see kind of a very similar pattern. So there is no denying that the climate is heating up, the world is heating up. The effects of that we see in terms of loss of ice sheets, both at the pole. There are several metrics. It shows that we are losing ice sheets. And if you look at the collection of greenhouse gases, so the big ones are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Their concentration in the environment is going up. Okay, so just to set the stage, in case there are any climate deniers in this room, there's plenty of data, and we can go talk about this data for a long time. There's no denying that the Earth is heating up, and we need to do something about that. So let's talk about the part of doing something about it, with pursuing net zero. Yeah. So if you want to take any action, we need to see where the greenhouse gas emissions come from. And the biggest source of contributors of greenhouse gas emissions is energy use, about 73%. And within that, energy that is required in the buildings for electrification, heating, or cooling the buildings. Right? When I think about all the malls that we go to, you're freezing in the malls. Well, it takes a lot of electricity. That is the biggest use of energy that causes emissions. That's about 24%. That's those buildings. Industry that is required for producing things, that is 24%. Transportation, which is where a lot of energy is focused, a lot of attention is focused. Because we are looking at electric vehicles and things like that. That's the third biggest contributor to energy-based emissions, 16%. And then there are other things such as that we have less control over. It's about 13%. The second biggest contributor is agriculture sector, agriculture and forestry. And there are, again, we can look at all the details, but one of the easiest one to fix is crop burning. 3.5% of GHG emissions from just burning the crop. And we know that that has other consequences as well. Right? So we have seen the haze in the past. So the last 10 years that I've been living in Malaysia, we have had haze episodes more than once that I can remember. I think 2015, 2016 was one of the worst ones. So it has detrimental health effects and so on as well. So we can look at these energy emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions, and see what is the contribution of that, where they are coming from. So we can start tackling where we can make the biggest impact. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we know that energy itself is the source of energy, is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases. So what initiatives do we have for that? Well, we're talking about wind energy, or solar power, for reducing transportation-related emissions that come from burning of fossil fuel, like petrol and diesel in cars. We talk about electric vehicles. And then for things that come from agricultural waste, there are initiatives like composting. And then we do some recycling and so on. So again, we have various initiatives in place for attacking or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now the question is, how effective are they? Are they addressing us the problem that helping us get to the journey of net zero by say a certain year, 2050, 2040, or are we not on track? So let me give you some examples. Let's take one example. So Shell had a plan for net zero, and this is published just March of this year, March 15, 2024. And the news is that they are scaling back on their promises that they had made for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for net zero promises. And the reason given for that is that they said, well, when we provided the 2035 target, we assumed that the world was going to provide develop an accounting system for tracking carbon. That hasn't happened. So because that hasn't happened, we cannot track the 2035 target. Let me just close this door. It's actually distracting me. I don't know if it is distracting you. Okay, and in the same news article, it says that uncertainty in the pace of change across many industries and across the broader transition is one of the reasons why we cannot meet the targets. So they scale back the program. Okay, this is news from this year. Okay, let's take one more example. Not oil and gas industry, but a very different kind of company. A company that is in consulting services, business services. And E&Y had net zero pledges, and they are rethinking about that. And again, this article is from April 1st, 2024, and I don't think it's an April Fool's Day article. And the reason that they give for changing their mind or commitments on net zero is it included heavy use of carbon offset, which itself has some problems. The market has been ravaged by controversy, and so E&Y has to rethink, which means it's partly due to evolving standards. So the standards themselves are changing as well. Okay, and I'm going to give you one more example, and I want us to see what is the common theme here. Why is it that companies that had made pledges to reduce emissions are now scaling back on their promises that they had made one time? Okay, so the third example, this is the last example, is kind of a more general example. So there's a project called Project Net Zero Tracker, and the project lead for that, they examined more than 1,000 companies that had made some kind of net zero emissions pledges. And look at this. I mean, this is a reality check. Okay, out of 1,000 companies, only 38, less than 4%, are doing bare minimum. It's not like they are on target. 3% or 4% are on target. They are doing bare minimum out of 1,000 companies required to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. So most companies are not even doing bare minimum. In fact, the rest are not even meeting the starting line criteria. So we are at a summit like this, and the reality is that most people are not doing anything. So what is the starting line criteria? Is basic stuff. Just track your carbon emission, carbon footprint across the supply chain. Basic stuff. Not doing anything, just measure. Right? Immediately cut emissions that you can. Create a credible plan, a scientifically credible plan for using carbon offset. Just create a plan. Not implement it, just create a plan. And then in your annual report, start reporting on what you're doing with those targets. Most of the companies are not even doing that. And this is published in 2023, last year. So it is not, we're not talking about 10-year-old news here. So why is this the case? Why are companies, we know that the world is on fire, literally. We see that in the news, we see that in statistics, and companies have made pledges to do something about it. And now they are going back on their reneging on their promises. And most companies are not doing anything about that. So why is that the case? So McKinsey had published a study. McKinsey does a lot of publishes a lot of reports, and they have come up with some really interesting articles. This was published literally about 2 weeks ago, 27 this year. And here are just some excerpts. Okay, so my slides are a little wordy. That's because I've taken the extract from these articles verbatim, because I wanted to know exactly what the article says, not in my own words, but what the article says. But I'll highlight what I think is really critical here. So they're saying that the gap between what we need to do and what we're actually doing is massive. And there's only about 10% deployment of low emissions technology globally needed to get us to 2050 net zero goals. Only 10%, which is consistent with what I showed you on the previous slide, right? 3.8% of the companies are doing bare minimum. And even what has been deployed in cases that are fairly easy. There's no challenge. There are no trade-offs. So we like to talk about tension between people, profit, and planet. It's very clear what we put our money on. It's not planet. Maybe some of it is people, but it is mostly profit. Okay, so there's a disconnect between our talk and our walk. In the previous session, one of the speakers actually said that no, we want companies to walk the talk, not just talk. Okay, so again, let's try to understand why that happens. So, if you go to the next slide, please. So again, from the same article, you see there are three main challenges. Why companies fail to deploy these technologies on scale for us to meet our 2050 net zero goals. Number one is it's difficult to make a business case. We don't know about this uncertainty about economic risk returns. The policies of different countries, they are not predictable. And as a result of that, we can't really say that in the short-term interest of shareholders, this is the right thing to do for the long term. Okay, so business case is challenging. That's number one. Second, most of the technology, I would say many of the technologies, they are cost effective, but they lack the scale. So lack the scale for manufacturing capacity, or as well as over time we learn and we can improve the technology and reduce the cost of producing the technology. So we are not there yet. So that is lacking. And third is that there are several technologies that are not tested, but what we need for that is we need like a multi-year, multi-project supply chain development. Things that are going to take a long time, multiple years. We need to invest in that. And as a result of that, they create uncertainty. So if we just summarize all of this, is we need to do something about net zero. Most companies are not doing anything. That's the reality of today. And the root cause of that, why we are not doing something about it, or something meaningful about it, is because of this tremendous uncertainty about how this space will evolve. Okay, so what should we do? How do we deal with that? So I'll talk about that next, but I'll see if you have any questions or comments based on what we have seen so far. Okay, if not, no, just don't be shy, Nabil, because we all can learn from each other. Yeah? So that's the ground. Okay, the central problem here is uncertainty. So what I'll talk about in the next few slides is how do we deal with uncertainty. So the challenge here is decision making under uncertainty. Critical uncertainty. It's not about probabilities that we use in the risk analysis. It's not saying that there is a 3% likelihood of this happening or 17% chance. We cannot even put numbers on this uncertainty. So how do we make decisions when we are grappling with some massive uncertainty for which many companies, many people don't even have an apparatus, don't even have the right tools to make decisions. Most of our uncertainty analysis is basically risk analysis, right? We take probabilities, we calculate expected values, and we say, okay, is this the right thing to do or not? That's hard to do. Okay, so again, the same, again, another McKinsey article, again, what says that it requires action on many fronts. We'll see what that means. I'll give you an example. And we need to make changes to supply networks, manufacturing processes, business models. So it is much easier to talk that we need to have net zero, but implementing that is much, much harder. Okay, let's take one example. Yeah. So, a wind farm. If we want to produce wind energy, what do we need? We need to have the wind turbines. Now, a typical utility scale turbine has about 8,000 parts. Think about the supply chain that is needed for that. Think about the companies that are going to produce those parts. Think about the transportation needed for moving those parts from their parts manufacturers to sub-assembly providers, from there to the assemblers. Yeah, so we need that supply chain. For many of these parts, to produce them, it takes hours. Like to produce one blade takes between 24 and 38 hours. So we are talking about some specialized manufacturing capability. Does it exist? If not, are we creating it? What's the investment required for creating that capability? Now that's just the manufacturing part. Second is transportation. Now to move these big giant wind turbines on site, the towers are about more than 300 feet tall, the blades are more than 300 feet long. So 300 feet is about a 20-story building. Okay, so just imagine that, kind of a high-rise building. How do you move that stuff on the road? Do we have the roads? How do we go under highways, underpasses, right? Do we have the cranes to install that? Of course, I'm not saying this does not exist, but think about what is required to make these investments to create a wind farm, right? Now, once you install the wind turbine, then you need to connect to the grid, and there are other issues about you need a battery system for storing the electricity, because you would be in wind turbines case, for example, wind farms, you are not producing electricity all the time, right? So the supply or production of electricity may not match with the demand for it at that time. So you need storage space for that. So you need to invest in battery systems. There is periodic maintenance required. You need people who are doing that work. You need talent for that. There is research and development that happens in the background. Okay, so there is research and development on the materials required for making different parts in the wind turbines. Some complex engineering that is required for making these turbines, creating the designs and making them. So all of that is fraught with uncertainty. And when we talk about net zero, what we are talking about here is we are talking about infrastructure investments. A manufacturing infrastructure, along with necessary talent required for implementing, so making that infrastructure work. And that infrastructure often takes multiple years to build. And once you build it, it stays in service for a long time. Once you build a factory, you don't change your mind 6 months later and say, oh, you know what, that was not the right thing to do. The policy has changed, okay, I'm going to close the factory. No, once you build it, it's going to be there for a long time. So we're talking about building an infrastructure to support net zero. We're talking about things that will happen over a 10, 20, 30-year planning horizon. And not just 30 years from now we want to achieve net zero, not that. It's creating an infrastructure that's going to last for a long time. So how do we plan for that infrastructure? How do we decide what is the right technology to invest in? How big our factories should be? Where should they be located? Who our suppliers should be? How do we decide all of that? So let's see how we make decisions, how we plan for the future. We do planning for the future now, right? So no, everybody, all of us do planning for the future in our jobs, in our homes, in our family lives, and so on. So, so let me run this slide because there is a lot of stuff happening here. So let's say today I want to plan for tomorrow. Imagine I'm a retailer, and I want to know what my demand for a particular product will be. So I can take what I know about today or yesterday or my recent trends, and I can project that forward. I can forecast it, and it will be very accurate. Tomorrow is going to look much like today, very similar to today. What about 1 month from now? Can we be as accurate? Is 1 month from now going to look exactly like today? Well, probably not, but we can still be very precise. We can still be pretty accurate. We can get close to it and provide some margin of error and say 1 month from now will look very similar to today, but some variation, and we would still be pretty accurate. So we know how to plan for tomorrow, how to plan for 1 month from now. But what about planning for years from today? Planning for 10 years from today? 20 years from today? Can we do the same thing? Can we say that I have time series data for the last 3 years? I can analyze that, estimate the pattern in that data, and project it forward, extrapolate it for the next 20 years. We can do that. Will it be realistic? It will not be. And this is a challenge. This is one of the reasons why companies are struggling with pursuing net zero goals, because it requires to think for the really long term, and we often lack the tools to plan for the long term. So what I'm going to share with you is one tool that we have used in my research. I do research on this topic that I'm going to share with you, but we also have applied it both in government sector as well as in companies. And I have a few examples here that I'll share with you, but also there's a lot more work that we have done that I will be happy to talk about. And that tool is, that's okay, I'll do it. Still a lot of animation. That is called scenario planning. And what scenario planning does is to, instead of starting from where we are today and projecting our history and our present into the future, scenario planning starts in the future. And you create multiple scenarios and say, well, what if the future looks like this red orb? Or what if the future looks like this blue circle? How should we prepare for that? So the directionality of planning is completely different. Our traditional planning starts from historical data and goes into the future. Scenario planning starts into the future and works backwards to say, how do we prepare for that? A lot of those scenarios are actually used for in climate governance and this kind of net zero space. Okay, so the idea is to work backwards from the future. And the reason for doing that is when we are operating in this domain of uncertainty, we cannot really predict what the future is going to look like. It's hard to do that. So might as well not try to attempt to do that for the long term. And instead of saying, I'm going to predict the future and plan for it, say, imagine what might happen and let's prepare for that. So for example, if you want to build a wind farm, think about what the future might look like that is relevant to our wind farm and design the wind farm accordingly so we will be successful in that future or whatever happens. Now you're saying, well, lots of questions, right? How do you come up with this scenario? So we'll talk about that. Okay, so it's not about forecasting, but it's not about predicting, but it's about preparation, it's about learning. Learn about how the business environment is changing, how the policy is changing in different countries. What are the new technologies that are coming along? And adapt, accommodate those changes and adjust. Instead of saying, you know what, I must have a plan, I must create a plan, I must create a business plan. It's not going to work. It's very hard to do. Let's think about the general direction that we need to go in and work in that direction. Okay, so just to give you some background of scenario planning, where it comes from is, well, even though we are dealing with this massive uncertainty about net zero right now, this is not the first time the world has encountered uncertainty. We have faced uncertainty for a long time in many, if you look back into the history, there have been many episodes where we just didn't know how the future was going to unfold, and people had to make decisions. So scenario planning evolved in the 1950s after the end of the Second World War. When the world order had changed significantly, there was a lot of destruction in Europe. America was mostly spared, and one of the origins of scenario planning is in the Department of Defense sector at the RAND Institute in America. They said, well, there's a new world order emerging, there's a rise of communism, fascism had been defeated at that time. How do we prepare for this new world? What do we do to protect the country against this new threat? That's the origin of scenario planning. Its use started in the government sector. In 1960, government of France used scenario planning for the first time for their 5-year national plan. So just like Malaysia does 5-year economic planning, France used it. France had a similar approach, similar planning process, and they used it for developing their national plan. Okay, so the use until now is primarily in the government sector. Until 1967, when Royal Dutch Shell was the first company that we know of that started using scenario planning. It was a small planning group within Shell, kind of on the fringes within their planning machinery. They said, well, we are getting into a world that is not as predictable as we make it sound in our planning process. And we can think about multiple scenarios. And Shell started using these scenarios in 1967. In 1973, there was an oil shock, and that came from the war in the Middle East between, it was called Arab-Israeli War, or Yom Kippur War, different names for it. At that time, in response to the Western powers' support to the Israeli government, the OPEC said, we are going to have oil embargo, and the price of oil went up from $2 a barrel to $8 in just a matter of weeks. 400% increase. We have never seen that kind of increase since then. We have seen price of oil go up, but not to that magnitude in terms of relative terms. 400% increase in just a matter of weeks. At that time, Shell was the only oil major that was prepared to deal with that kind of change in the oil market. So the news got out, and companies realized, hey, how come Shell knew how to prepare for this kind of price increase? How come other companies, Esso, say Exxon and Mobil, for example, they didn't know that? And they realized that, well, Shell has been using something called scenario planning. And once that word got out, by 1980s, there's this study that came out in 1980s that showed that about between 33 and 50% of companies in Fortune 1000 companies reported or admitted to using scenario planning. If the companies worked in a heavy capital-intensive industry, they were more likely to use scenario planning than, say, maybe retailers and so on. And since then, the use of scenario planning has gone up and down. Anytime the world is more predictable, the use goes down. Anytime there is more uncertainty, such as after the dot-com bubble burst and the financial crisis of 2007, the use went up. During COVID, the use skyrocketed. Everybody was making scenarios. Brexit 2016-2017, lots of scenario studies came out. So the tool that is used widely when there is greater uncertainty. And even within supply chain sector, there are some famous examples. One of the most famous examples is scenario planning used at UPS. Is anybody familiar with this? UPS scenario planning? Okay, so I'll give this kind of an interesting anecdote. So UPS, which is company like DHL, And what they do is they are in the parcel shipping business. Right? So they collect shipments, parcels, and letters. So this is 1997. So email is not as widely used as it is today, right? So if companies have to ship any important documents, any paperwork, they are using UPS overnight service. So the way UPS is set up at that time is in every major city or metropolitan area, they have a hub. It's like a sorting facility, like what Post Malaysia would have. By nature, that sorting facility is not in the downtown area. It's usually on the outskirts, where the land is cheaper, rent is lower. Okay, so, and then there are trucks. So the trucks go to the city, they collect the packages and mail, bring it to the sorting center. The sorting center sorts them, they get back on trucks again, goes to the airport overnight. And at night, the packages get shipped. Now, if you want to see supply chain in action, you should see an airport at night where one of these companies are headquartered. So I had a chance to visit Memphis Airport, where FedEx is headquartered. And the time to visit Memphis Airport or the FedEx facility, that's the main distribution center for the entire United States, is from midnight until 5 a.m. Okay, so we went to FedEx facility, and UPS will be similar. And now we are with the company executives, senior executives at the company, and they said, okay, get in the bus, and we are going to show you supply chain in action. Okay, sure. So we get into the bus, we get on the Memphis airport, we get to the runway, and the bus parks, kind of in a safe area, and say, okay, look at the sky, and you look at the sky, and you see a string of lights, like a pearl necklace in a straight line. And these are all airplanes that are waiting to land at the airport at 1 o'clock in the morning. And every minute there is a plane landing. And these planes are coming from all over the United States, from say Boston, Los Angeles, Dallas, San Francisco. Every minute there is a plane landing. The plane lands, cargo is unloaded, it goes to the sorting facility that is right at the airport. So packages from Boston, they get sorted, and now they are loaded back on the trucks to go to the destination airport. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, the planes start taking off. Overnight delivery, supply chain in action, right? Invisible to all of us. It's fascinating to see. So UPS network was like that. You have these sorting centers that would collect the mail throughout the day, that gets shipped to the local airport at night, and next morning they will get delivery from the airport to the sorting facility, and again it gets on the trucks, and the trucks make the delivery to the city, overnight delivery. So in 1997, UPS for the first time realized that, well, the world was changing a little bit, and they had to rethink their strategy. And they used scenario planning for the first time at that time. And they realized that, well, there's something called e-commerce that's coming up. Okay, this is 1997. Amazon had just launched. Okay, so we are talking about early days really, of internet here. They said, well, that could really make our world quite different and kind of hurt our business. And what they did was they, as a result of the deliberations that they had, they ended up buying a company called Mailboxes, etc. And this company had a very different footprint. They had stores in the downtown areas. So store that you can walk to and deliver stuff from there. They also had very nice customer service agents who you can talk to. They'll give you useful advice. They had packaging supplies. And one of the scenarios UPS created told them that, well, there could be a world where there is a lot of P2P, peer-to-peer, or you can call it C2C, consumer-to-consumer mail, like eBay kind of business. And for those people, they don't want to drive outside the city for half an hour, deal with an industrial, grubby-looking facility where people are not trained to provide customer service to consumers. Right? They are dealing with drivers, truck drivers, right? Different kind of capability we are talking about. So we really need to have this capability. So they bought this company called Mailboxes, etc. That company exists today. It's a UPS part now. In fact, it's in Malaysia. Have you seen it? Yeah? Where have you seen it? Yeah, shopping malls, right? You go to, say, Gardens Mall or Mid Valley, there is a Mailboxes, etc. store. And you can go there and get packaging supplies and so on, right? So UPS bought this company in the year 2001 for $191 million. Okay, they realized that they needed this kind of very different footprint. They had about 3,000 stores in the downtown areas where people can walk to it, do their packaging and so on. UPS's biggest competitor at that time in the US, FedEx, realized that, wow, if we don't do the same thing, we will go out of business. So they ended up buying a company called Kinko's, which has 1,200 stores, 1/3 as many as Mailboxes, etc. And they ended up buying that company for $2.2 billion, more than 10 times the price. That's because Kinko's realized that their small stores are a lot more worth than what Mailboxes, etc. are for. And this is often given as an example that using scenarios, UPS executives were able to see something about an uncertain future that their competitor, also run by a very successful company, run by very smart people, could not. And that is an example. And there are, people don't often talk about how they came up with the strategy. Companies don't publish that. But this is one case that we know of. There are a few other cases, but this is one very famous case. And that's often seen as the power of scenario planning. But it is used by a lot of companies. And one of the best users of scenario planning in the world, one of the best practitioners of scenario planning in the world, is right in our backyard, government of Singapore. Singapore uses scenario planning extensively for their public policy implementation. They have a department that reports to the Prime Minister's office. They create scenarios, think about different contingencies. So we have tools. There are tools, such as scenario planning, that help us decide how we should make big investments, make big bets when the future is highly uncertain or unpredictable. Okay, so and then we wrote a book about this because we did a lot of work in companies, and then we wrote a book that talks about various questions. So I'll talk about what those questions are before we go in. But let's say there's a question.
Just curious, how do you make the distinction between a scenario and a prediction? Because what UPS did kind of sounds like a prediction.
Great question. So a scenario is never a single scenario. You create scenarios in a set. So you'll say, okay, well, we don't know what the future is going to look like. If I told you, here's the future, that would be a prediction. Right? Say, okay, here's what's going to happen. Well, scenario planners believe that we don't know what the future is going to look like. We cannot even predict what the future is going to look like. But what we can tell you is what it might look like. So scenarios, generally, they are created in a set of 2 to 5 scenarios based on the uncertainty. I'll say, well, these are the different drivers that are shaping our world, and based on what we know about them, based on how they're evolving, we think that we might have a scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it is always they're created in a set. So there's always more than one scenario. And all these scenarios are, we call them, they're plausible. That means they can happen. But we don't know which one is going to happen. In fact, none of them might happen.
Just a follow-up. So is it like something that would be peer reviewed by the industry, or is it, how does an organization confirm or deny that scenario?
That is a fantastic question. You don't. There's no way to confirm it. It's about an imaginary future. Right? It's about an imaginary future. We cannot say that this is the right future, that is the right imagination. We cannot do that. And that's why when we check scenarios, we can only know if the scenarios were good or not by that definition only after the time has passed, when it is too late. So the goal of scenarios is not to predict, but to educate people, to help us learn about the uncertainties and to grapple with the uncertainty. Now what I mean by grapple with uncertainty is, okay, think about a situation when you have to make a decision under uncertainty. What do we typically do? How do we decide? Let's say you want to decide about where should I go to on vacation, say 1 year from now. How do we decide? Well, first, it's a hard question, right? So we all say, oh, I don't know what the ringgit interest rate is going to look like. Right? I don't know if there is going to be, if that particular location is going to be receptive to the tourists, or they are going to spray me with water when I'm eating at a restaurant, like what happened in Barcelona, right? So there could be a lot of uncertainties. Right? But how do we deal with uncertainty like that? Okay, forget that. Okay, think about your company. You have to you have to decide. Let's build a factory. How do we decide how big the factory should be? We make some assumptions. We assume that, well, our demand right now is this much. We are very optimistic. We are going to have a demand growth of 15% for next year. So that will be our demand. Maybe give it some room of error, margin of error. And then we do some due diligence, talk with 2-3 different companies and say, okay, well, they're selling their services for whatever equipment, technology, these are the prices. Let's invest in that. So typically when we think about the future, we make a forecast implicitly and we work towards it. We may not call it a forecast, but we make a bunch of assumptions. So instead of that, scenario planning says, well, don't just assume one future. Think about 3 or 4 futures and then use that for making your plans. Yes, ma'am, you have a question? Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Shadow, for sharing with us strategic planning. In fact, several decades ago, one gentleman who was hailing MIMOS, he had this great idea to tell the government that in Malaysia's economic planning, we should incorporate scenario planning. So I was very fortunate to be one of the group that's called Scenario Planning Malaysia, and we invited Shell to come and teach us, because at that time I think they were the big players. But unfortunately, after we had attended this long course and gained some insights, however, the government was not ready to take this up, and it wasn't taken up. I'm happy to share that the gentleman who recommended this is now the science advisor to the Prime Minister. So I hope that with his vision, and now with his new role, he can then, I would say, encourage the government to do that. Because from your sharing of strategic planning, it looks like it's more from an industry business perspective. But you have shared that Singapore has one unit that looks at strategic planning, scenario planning. Is that more for investments in business industry, or is it for economic planning? Could you share with us?
Yes, it's all kind of planning. And I'm going to share one example of use of scenario planning in government sector that we have been involved in firsthand. So I know it quite well. Okay, so I'll give you first an example, but I'm very happy to that you shared this. This is fantastic. So thank you. Yeah? And I really hope that we start using kind of techniques like this, which is what we need in today's world. The world is highly complex, very uncertain. We cannot keep using the tools that were developed in 1950s and 60s when the world was very stable. We need new tools. So you might have questions like, well, you're asking me to imagine a bunch of futures and bet my company's future on these imaginary stories. and it was kind of your question as well, right? Is that how do you validate that? How do you say that that's the right story? So the first question is, how do you develop these scenarios which are completely fictional? There's no way to say that this is the right scenario or the wrong scenario. There's no way to justify that. But they're completely fictional, but we use them as a tool for guiding our thinking. So how do you develop them? And there's a systematic process for that. The process comes from Shell, it has been refined over the years. We have applied this process in more than half a dozen projects, both within the government and within companies. So there is a process. And also we talk about that, and if we have time, I'll share that process with you. Second is, well, let's say we have the scenarios, how should we use them? And I may have an example for this, but basically the use of scenarios is, instead of making one big bet, you make investment in stage-wise. You make smaller incremental investment towards a big bet. In a way, so that you can change if the environment changes in an unpredictable manner. And we have seen companies do this. I'll give you two examples. So when I came to Malaysia in 2014, I got in touch with one company that was doing some work in the oil palm sector. Okay, I cannot tell you more than that. And they were building a refinery. And I got in touch with this company. I said, you know what, you're building a refinery, you should really think about scenario planning because you're making a multi-year investment. And they said, no, we know exactly what we want. Okay, we have support from the government, we are going to go ahead, there's no uncertainty here. Sure. So they started building this refinery. 1 year later, they abandoned it completely because things had changed. Price of oil had palm oil had come down and so on. So it was completely abandoned. So things happen that are outside our control, that we cannot predict, and we need to create our infrastructure so that we can adapt as things change. So how we use scenarios, we talk about that. And third is the question is, how do you know this works? It sounds like I'm sorry, there are consultants in the room, pardon me, but if I was a consultant, if I had a tool, I would just sell this. How do I know it works? And me as an academic, that's something we care about a lot. Is there evidence that scenario planning changes minds? Is there proof of that? And this is the question that I was studying, that I explored in my doctoral studies. And when I was doing my research in 2008 and so on, I found that there was very little evidence, objective scientific evidence, that showed scenario planning was effective. There were 2 or 3 studies, not many. And 2 of them actually contradicted each other, which is good, which is what we need for science. But most of the evidence was anecdotal stories. A company like UPS will say, look, we were successful because we used scenario planning. Other companies will say, we use scenario planning, that's why we made this big bet and we are successful. But we don't know many other companies that we have used scenario planning and they have failed. We don't know that because they are not publicizing their failures. So one of the things that we started doing was to actually start measuring, does this thing work? And the quick answer is yes. And I'm going to share the evidence with you. Okay, so in our book we talk about 3 kinds of companies, and the reason I mention that is because it's interesting how they fit in the bigger supply chain. So we work with a food and beverage company where scenario planning was used to come up with the supply chain strategy. So how should the distribution network look like? Should they have their own trucks? Should they have their own retail outlets and so on? So their supply chain is a servant of the business. Okay, so supply chain is a supporting function of the business of food and beverage. Second project we did was with a pharmaceutical distributor. And these companies, they have their own network of distribution centers, trucks and so on. And what they do is they buy medicines from companies like Pfizer, Merck and so on, and they distribute them to thousands or tens of thousands of hospitals and pharmacies. So how should that infrastructure look like? And this is where the answer to this question is the business strategy of the company itself. How do I build my business's infrastructure, distribution infrastructure? And the third project we did was, which I'll share with you, was a project called Future Freight Flows. And this is if you Google this, you can find a lot of documentation. It was a government-sponsored project, so the information is out open in the public. But the question that we tackled in this project was a sponsored project by Federal Highway Administration back in the US when I was still doing my PhD. And they said, look, the world is changing. The world is globalizing. But there are lots of forces. There are environmental concerns. We don't know if the trade is going to remain global as it was in 2008-9, or there could be people might not like this free trade. So there are a lot of uncertainties. At the same time, we need to make infrastructure investments in freight infrastructure. So how should we make those investments? So one example from that is we developed scenarios, 4 scenarios based on our research, and we actually applied them with 6 different organizations in the country. One of them was State of Washington. So if you are not very familiar with the map of the United States, this is the United States. Here's the Atlantic Ocean. California is on this side. This is the Pacific Ocean. And State of Washington is in the northwest, which is highlighted. And north of State of Washington is Canada. Okay, so the project that we did with State of Washington, they looked at 16 different kinds of investments. So they were asking questions like, should we invest more into the north-south highway, the roads, to carry freight? So this is all about freight, not passenger infrastructure. Or should we invest in the road that goes east and west, east to west? Okay, and we're talking about expanding the road, building more capacity for that road, right? Long-term investment decisions. You have to get environmental clearance, you have to acquire land, you have to build it, and once you do that, it stays there for several years. So the planning horizon for this project was 30 years. Okay, so we're making plans for the next 30 years without knowing what the 30 years are going to look like. Or should we invest in kind of smaller roads that connect to Canada in case there is more trade coming from Canada or going from US to the Canada? Or should we actually invest in rail lines instead of road? Or instead of that, should we invest in say waterways? There are some big rivers in the state of Washington. Should we invest in that? Should we build more ports? Should we build in dredging capacity to deepen the waterways so bigger ships can get to the waterways? Or should we do something else? Should we invest in something like, say, pipeline networks? Okay, so there are 16 projects like this. The idea is that any of these investments, they are infrastructure investments. They'll take a long time to build, and they'll stay in the use for a long time. So all the projects were of this nature. And the scenarios that we created, and the way this worked, and this is maybe to your question. Okay, so how a typical scenario planning initiative looks like is a collaboration between private companies, government, public sector, academia. We think that academia plays a very important role, but we also have the NGOs like environmental groups, aboriginal groups in the state of Washington. They were involved. So it was a collaboration between multiple stakeholders that came together, and there would be one issue. The one issue is how should we build the freight infrastructure for the state to remain competitive for the next 30 years. When we talk about net zero, we can ask a similar question, right? How should we pursue net zero? To achieve, what should we do? What should we invest in to achieve the net zero goals, to get to net zero by 2050? That's kind of the focal question. And the way we pursued that is by, we had developed scenarios, a planning process, but then we did workshops. in the country. So each workshop, we invited people, about 50 to 60 people. And these are the people that are experts in their domain. Okay, so think about, if you're in the state of Washington, who would you invite? So you invite transportation planners from the state of Washington. You would invite transportation planners from the federal level. You would invite transportation planners from the city level, like cities like Seattle, right? They have their own planning departments. But then you also invite people from companies that are in the region. So Amazon is in the region, big use of infrastructure. They have people who know about future transportation needs of the state. You will invite them. Nike has headquarters in the state of Oregon, which is just south of Washington. So you invite people from Nike. So you invite people from the industry to take their input. The state of Washington has large areas that are owned by what they call American Indian groups, the Aboriginal group, like the Orang Asli groups. Right? So invite those because they control the land. Right? So invite them. You invite consultants from transportation agents, transportation consultants, academics. So you get a group of diverse people. These are experts, about 50 or 60 of them. And we invited them to this workshop. Each expert we assigned to one scenario and say, okay, read this one scenario really well before you come to the workshop, and we are going to have one-day workshop. Then we will ask you, what should we invest in? Should we invest in that north-south highway, or should we invest in the waterways? How favorable are different investments? Those are the questions we will ask. And then we facilitate this discussion using multiple scenarios. Okay? And then they give us recommendations. So it's a collaboration between different kinds of stakeholders. So let me tell you what happened with that collaboration. So first of all, every workshop, the input that we got from these people was used for that group's planning processes. Okay, so if in the state of Washington, whatever output came from that workshop was used by the state for deciding its freight infrastructure investments. Okay. So these are the scenarios, and even though I might be deviating from kind of net zero discussion, what I want to give you a sense of is the uncertainty and how things can change, and why we need a process like this to deal with the uncertainty that currently has stopped companies from pursuing net zero, as we saw, as I shared with you early on during the presentation. So one major uncertainty that we discovered through our research was resource availability. Would companies have, would people have the resources that they need in terms of materials, energy, and things like that? And if you talk about net zero, think about all the minerals that are used for creating batteries and wind turbine parts and so on. And right now we know that those resources are quite concentrated in a few countries. Right? They are not widely available, so there could be uncertainty about their supply. So we had two scenarios. Resources could be adequate, or they could be quite scarce. The second scenario was, what would the trade look like? Would it be global, or would it be local? Now in 2009, 2010, when I was working on this project, everybody thought that the world was global warming. If you remember, in 2010, you can get anything from anywhere you want. Now there's outsourcing, the factories are moving out of the West, coming to China, going to other countries. It's a global world, it's a flat world. Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The Flat World. It was one of the New York Times bestsellers, saying that there are no more boundaries between countries. It's a flat world, you can get anything you want from anywhere. Global trade. So I said, well, yes, but we also see signs that it may not remain that way. People didn't believe us. But one of our scenarios was created using that. So we had one scenario that described what everybody thought was the world going to look like. It's global marketplace. You can get anything from anywhere you want. There's no resource scarcity, because if you don't have something in your country, you can get it from somewhere else. That was the world of 2009. Diagonally opposite of that was a scenario where there's tremendous resource scarcity, and the world is broken into multiple blocks. So I talked about a North America block, a European block, China and Africa block, and then some independent countries. And we used to ask people about, after each workshop, which one do you think is most likely? Not many people believe this world would ever exist. If I ask that same question now, yeah, we are probably in this world, a testing, where the world is broken down into multiple blocks. And many of us seem to think that that's how the world is going to be. Well, guess what? 5 years from now, things could be quite different, right? Things can change. And then we had two other scenarios that describe the other two diagonally opposite worlds. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit evidence of power of scenario planning, and maybe to your point of why this is something important that we should pursue in Malaysia, and not just for infrastructure building, for net zero, right? All kinds of projects, infrastructure investments. This is a very powerful process to use. So we asked all the people who are coming to our workshops before they came. Look, these are the 16 projects the state is thinking about investing in. Should we invest in that? Yes or no? Yeah. And then, how confident are you about your answer? Do you think it's a good answer? Do you think that's going to be, or say you're uncertain about it? And then we asked them the same question after they had participated in discussion of one scenario, which takes about half a day. It takes several hours, and then you really get into the scenario. And what we found is that about 70% of the people changed their minds after thinking about just one scenario. And they changed their minds in a very systematic way. If they found that that particular project was useful in one scenario that they had used, they became more favorable of making an investment in that project. If they found that that one scenario was wasteful, the scenario, one investment was wasteful in the scenario they had used, they became less favorable of making that investment. Okay, and we found like statistical significance and all of that.
Can you repeat that again? That's very important.
Yeah.
When you say that they are most important.
Yeah. So we come to the workshop, and you are an expert. Okay, you really know a lot about a particular domain, and I'm asking your opinion. Tell me, should I invest in this? You are the expert. And before I give you the scenario to read, you tell me, based on my expert knowledge, I think you should make this investment. Now we give you one scenario to read. And you read the scenario, you come to the workshop, you discuss that scenario with 15 other people. And after that discussion, you realize that, wow, this investment, which I thought was a good idea, doesn't really work very well in this scenario. So we ask you the same question again after you use that scenario, and if the investment didn't work very well in that scenario, you are more likely to change your answer from yes to no. Or you might at least become less confident in your answer. On the other hand, you found that, no, you said, no, this is not a good idea, don't invest in this before the workshop. And then we give you a scenario, and in that scenario you find that the investment works really well. And you are more likely to be favorable in making that investment. And the reason this is important is because these 50 or 60 people that came to workshop, they were experts. They were handpicked people at the planning agency. They said, go talk to this guy or this lady. He knows a lot about it. We want their opinion. And in 70% of the cases, their judgment changed. From either yes to no or no to yes, or they became more confident or less confident, and these are changes very systematic. So the first is that they changed their investment judgment, but what really matters is that there is a very clear evidence that it changes your mindset. And one of the things that happens when people are facing uncertainty or have to make decisions under uncertainty, they get stuck because they don't know. They have ideas, but they cannot come to an agreement. And oftentimes, it's not the problem is not in infrastructure investment itself, but often is our mindset. So one thing we see is that this tool is very powerful for changing people's minds, and we have seen evidence of that. But that's not enough. Okay? There is more. We are talking about making actual investment decisions, not just changing minds. So in another workshop, we did some measurement after how people vote on their investment decisions before coming to the workshop and after using multiple scenarios. Okay, so not one scenario but multiple scenarios. And we gave them 4 different choices. We asked them, how should we invest in this freight infrastructure? The least flexible option was start building a road. Okay, or not, kind of simple, of that nature. The most flexible was just allocate money, don't do anything. And 2 options in between. And again, we had experts who evaluated a lot of, more than 300 data points, and what we see is that a significant number of them would choose a very fixed, rigid investment, like the example that I mentioned, right? Oh, we know exactly what all palm oil market is going to look like. We must build a refinery. Let's build a refinery. Rigid investment. But after using multiple scenarios, they say, well, that's not a good idea. Other things can happen that we haven't thought of. We must do this in a stage-wise manner. So they become less favorable of making rigid investment and more favorable of making more flexible investments. And this is very important. In my mind, this is what we need to go from inaction to action. Right now we are stuck. We are not doing enough for net zero because we think we need to have the right answer. We are not going to have that. We are not going to know the right answer. But we can start taking smaller steps. So we have to start thinking about how can we take action with strategic flexibility. Now that might sound like a buzzword, but let me tell you, it has a deep, specific meaning. Strategic flexibility means knowing exactly what can be made rigid, what can I invest in confidently today, and where do I need to keep some room for maneuvering. And when we do this work with companies, we did a scenario project with a chemical company, a very large chemical company, global chemical company, with their Asia Pacific business, which supported, they had a scenario, a supply chain group based in Hong Kong that supported 27 businesses in Asia Pacific. And they had a list of 35 different projects. And what they did was, after applying scenario plan, they realized that some of these projects I can start implementing right away. Because no matter which scenario I think of, that project is useful. So I can start right away. Go ahead, go with it, start acting. But other projects, I'm not so sure of, because in some scenarios, it is a great idea, other scenarios, it doesn't work very well. So that's where I need flexibility. How do we build flexibility? There are various ways. Either we can delay acting on it, which is what's happening for net zero, for almost everything. Unless it's obvious, right? Like the McKinsey study said. Or we can create a build in a flexible manner. So to give you an example, if I have to build a road in a flexible manner, what can I do? Well, I can do environmental clearance. I can acquire the land. But instead of building a 6-lane highway, you can build a 2-lane highway. If we see there is more traffic is increasing, we can expand it. But that's a flexible investment, stage-wise investment. So instead of committing to a 6-lane highway right now, we can make investment in stage-wise manner. And what that does is that frees us from forcing ourselves to say, I must have the right answer, to saying that I can start taking action today in small steps. And that's why I think scenario planning is quite helpful, and it will be a great tool to break the deadlock that we have about net zero investment. And all the evidence that I've shared with you says that we are not doing, basically we are doing nothing. We are doing bare minimum. Less than 5% of the companies are doing bare minimum. That's the evidence we have. So we need to kind of find a way to break this uncertainty and get past it. Okay, so that's one example, and since I'm talking for 2 hours, I thought I'll give you a second example. Okay, so I have a few slides about scenario creation. I want to skip these, and I want to get to a second example. Let me skip this part as well. Happy to talk about this if you're interested afterwards. Okay, maybe I should talk about this part. Yeah. Okay, so I haven't really told you what scenario looks like, so I think it's a good idea to go through this fairly quickly. Okay, so when we talk about any strategy, so net zero strategy or supply chain strategy, I have an example of supply chain strategy. What we have is you're making decisions about a bunch of things. Okay, where should my factory be? Which suppliers do I use? What kind of distribution network do I use? What kind of IT systems I want to use? Talent capability and so on. All these decisions, they are in your control. So let's call this your black box. Okay? This is your supply chain strategy black box or your net zero black box. You design this. But how this black box actually works depends on things that are outside. Right? Things that we cannot control. Things like who are the customers? What does the demand look like? What are the regulations? What would the competition look like? A bunch of factors that we have no ability to control. Yeah? Now these factors are affected by even bigger macro level forces. Things like wars, geopolitical tensions, growing intensity of environmental effects of climate change, technological advances, right? Social harmony, very, very large macro level issues. So we use this kind of framework to think about scenario planning. And what we do is we figure out what these variables are in the black box, in the blue oval, and the green oval. And try to understand what kind of relationship they have, what kind of effect they have on each other. So we call this focal decision. That's what we want to design. We control that completely. What's in the blue oval is what is called local factor. These are the things we cannot control. These are like industry level forces, industry level factors. We can influence some of these, but we cannot control them. And then what is in the green oval is, they are called driving forces. We cannot control them, we cannot influence them. So when we talk about uncertainty in net zero, the uncertainty comes from things that are in the green oval. We don't know how that's going to look like, what government regulations are going to look like, how are banks going to respond to net zero, how are different companies going to respond. There are so many different technologies for carbon capture and so on that are not proven yet. They all lie in this green oval. So scenarios are about describing how that green oval looks like. And using those scenarios to think about what should in a particular scenario, what would the blue oval look like, industry factors look like, and then thinking inside from there to say, given that blue oval, what should my black box look like? So the process starts by collecting all these variables, and there's a ton of research involved, and then you develop scenario, and then you work from outside in. That's what we do, working from outside in. Think about the uncertainty and design your system accordingly. Okay, so that's kind of a brief about scenario planning, and then some of the work that we're doing now is we are saying, should a company develop scenarios on its own, or should it do it with its suppliers or with its customers? So that question might be a little bit premature if we don't do any scenario planning at all. Companies that are doing scenario planning, for them that question is important. And what we have found is that doing scenario planning with your strategic supplier is even more powerful than doing it yourself. I'll skip that part for now, because I do want to share my second example, which is a Malaysian case, but before that we have a question or comment.
Thank you, Doctor, for sharing with us this framework. Could I make a recommendation? Because you have STEEP, could I recommend that you extend it to STEEPLE, so that you add L legal and another E for ethics or ethical?
Thank you. That's very important. Yeah. So some people use, instead of STEEP, they use PESTLE, which has that L legal, but ethics is also very important. Yeah. So STEEPLE is very great. So thank you. I think next time I present this, I will make it STEEPLE. STEEPLE. Okay. So just to kind of summarize this. I'm sorry, I'm kind of running back and forth here. Okay, so we have done a lot of work on this. If you are interested, I'm happy to share our publications. Both they are both in manager publications like Harvard Business Review and so on, that are targeted towards practicing managers. And if you are interested in academic research, we have a lot of papers on that as well. So just some sample here. Happy to share this with you. Just send me an email. And if any of you are doing research on scenario planning, California Management Review has a special issue on scenario planning, which I'm editing, guest editing with some folks from Oxford, Wharton. These are some really leading scholars of scenario planning in the world. And we'll be happy to see your publications. We have about a month left for that. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left. No, 20, right? Yeah, okay, so I want to talk about what can we do now. So I talked about uncertainty in the long term, right? But what can we do now? Yes, we can start acting by thinking about scenarios and making stage-wise investment. But is there anything else we can do? And the answer is yes, and it is quite close to my heart. So if you look at GHG emissions, and if we take a systems view, as opposed to industry view. So systems view is looking at an industry end-to-end, from start to finish. There's a study that came out in Nature a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and that says that that looked at emissions, and they found that 34% of all emissions come from the food system. Okay, so it's about agriculture, and I was really pleased that we had a vegetarian meal, because there are a ton of emissions that come from production of meat. So about more than a third of the emissions, global emissions, come from agriculture or food systems. At the same time, 31% of all the food gets thrown away. It goes in the garbage. In fact, the amount of food that we waste is enormous, 1.6 billion tons. Okay, and then there's a reason why I'm sharing this with you. So when I hear the number 1.6 billion tons, I'm an engineer, but still I struggle with that number. I don't know what it means. How big is 1.6 billion tons? It's a big number, but how big is it? So let me put it in context. So let's take about a really heavy object that we all are familiar with. Petronas Twin Towers. Do you know how much do they weigh? How much they weigh? So each tower weighs about 300,000 tons, so the two towers are about 600,000 tons. So what that means is the amount of food that the world wastes is more than 2,600 Petronas Twin Towers every year. That's what we throw away every year. Or in other words, every day we throw away more than 7 Petronas Twin Towers, every day, in terms of food. Now there's a completely separate issue about hunger that I'm not even talking about today, because that's not our goal. We're talking about net zero. But let's do some simple math. Okay, 34% of global emissions come from food systems to produce food. We take all that food, all those emissions, 31% of them go straight into garbage. So if you want to do something today, Just think about that. 10% of our emissions come from food that just goes in the garbage. Now, for that, we don't need to do scenario planning. This is something we can do right now. Don't throw away food. Don't waste food. At the same time, there's a ton of food waste. So, what can we do about it? I will give you a solution. And that solution is right here in Malaysia on the Lost Food Project. How many of you know about the Lost Food Project? A few of you. I'm delighted to see that. So, it was started by an expatriate lady, Susan Mooney. She's a British expat who lived in Malaysia for a few years, but now she has moved back to Europe. And she started by saying, well, you go to a grocery store and you see a fancy grocery store, and if you go there at say 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., you'll see people are taking away bananas because they look a little bit black. And I asked them, what are you going to do with it? Oh, we cannot sell it, it goes in the garbage. And she would say, can I take it from you? Sure, okay, I take it from you. Now let's find out people who need it. And that's how the Lost Food Project was born. And this is close to my heart because I sit on the board of that. I'm the president of the board of directors, and we have a fantastic group of people involved in it. A very diverse group of people who are, these are all voluntary board members. Okay, there's no money involved for all these people. They're fully there because they care for it, care for what we do. So what we do is the following. We go to places like Pasar Borong, Kuala Lumpur, the wholesale market. So Pasar Borong has about 300 farmers. Okay, so it looks like this. This is a photo I took a few years ago. Wholesale, the farmers from say Cameron Highlands and other areas come there, bring their produce, and then restaurants and grocery stores, they will buy the stuff from here. There are two shifts, morning shift and afternoon shift. When the morning shift is over in the afternoon, like around 3 o'clock, they vacate the spot and the evening shift comes in. What do you think happens when the morning shift has to leave, but they haven't sold everything that they bought? Well, not everything goes in the garbage, but sometimes it is convenient, more convenient to get rid of things instead of bringing it all back and bringing, this is perishable product, right? So what we do is we have our truck that says, feed the hungry, not the landfill. And we say, oh, instead of throwing it away, we will take it in our truck. So we have 3 trucks now. We started with 1 5-ton truck, now we have 3. And we take the stuff that's going to go into the garbage, we stack, and then we bring it to people who need it. So there are more than 80 charities around Klang Valley that we distribute the food to. There are several PPRs, public housing. There are some smaller charities like children's houses, orphanages, single women's home, small schools, and so on. Okay, people who really need the food, and we distribute it to them. So these are all photos taken by our people. And in terms of impact, from 2022 to 23, we had 50% growth. We rescued 2.3 million kgs of food. Now put that number in the context of Petronas Twin Towers. It's a really, really tiny scratch, but we are making an impact. But if you look at the impact that we have had, we have saved almost more than 20 million kgs of CO2 equivalent emissions since the founding in 2016. Okay, there's more that I want. I'm not just telling this story to brag about it, but I'm telling this story because I want to tell you the challenges of GHG in personal terms, something that I know firsthand. So we are a food bank. Why? Because we donate we give people food to people who need it. In fact, we are Malaysia's largest food bank, if you look at the volume that we donate every year. But we are not just any kind of food bank. And now we have a warehouse, we call ourselves an eco-food bank. The reason being, most of the food banks in the world, they buy food. They'll take donations in terms of cash donations, and they'll go buy food, canned food, rice, noodles, things that have a long shelf life. And they will have a warehouse like this, and they'll stack it full so we can distribute to people. We buy zero. We don't buy any food. All our food is the food that would otherwise end up in the landfill and cause GHG emissions. So we're not just trying to solve hunger, we're also trying to solve net zero. This is something we are doing. We haven't stopped. We are acting on it. Unlike most of the companies, we are doing something. Okay, but there is more to this story. You will see most of our warehouse is empty, and we like it like that because we don't want to store food. We want to bring things in, perishable products, get them out. It's a supply chain innovation. Move things in and out really, really fast. Fast turnaround. It's a supply chain in action. We are not looking at carbon capture technology. We are thinking about how can you use supply chain to make an impact. To get the food that is going to cause emissions after it goes to the landfill, and instead of that, give it to the people who need it. The reason why we have so much storage space in the warehouse is because if a company calls us and says, I have 10,000, I have say 100 pallets, 10,000 boxes of cereal, can you take it? And I'm giving it to you because I misprinted the expiration date on it. This is how food waste happens. My packaging is wrong, so I cannot sell it. Would you take it? All good product. Sure. We have lots of storage space, we'll take it and then we'll move it. Okay, so that's what we do. We are an eco-food bag. Now, our biggest challenge is funding. And I know this as the president of the board. And when we 100% of our food is coming from the food that will go to the landfill, 100%. When we ask for funding, they say, well, what's your capex? We will be happy to build a warehouse for you, or we'll get a truck for you. They say, no, we have that already. What we need is we need money to run our operations, to pay our staff, to run the warehouse. People, companies, even banks, the willingness to pay for operations is very, very, very little. Everybody wants to see their name on the building. Pay for operations where it is making impact. It's so hard. So we have to write, we have a team, a couple of people, really dedicated people. All they do is to write grants. We get a lot of funding from overseas. We get some funding from Malaysia as well. But very hard to get paid for operations. This is one challenge. We have a solution that works, that is impacting emissions, but just to operate that, we cannot get funding. Okay, so we realize that, okay, people are not willing to give money away for funding, right? But think about that. Now, if you're a bank, right, we have heard a lot of presentations. Everybody wants to go net zero. Everybody's gonna go. When it comes to paying money, that enthusiasm is not as much as we see often when people talk. So there are other things that we are doing. So we are expanding to eco, but because we realize that there is more to be collected from there. We are working on getting carbon credits. So this is the kind of stuff that we are trying to do. If we can get a mechanism for providing carbon credits, and if there is a market for that, then we can monetize the impact of our work. We have some people who are trying to work with the government of Malaysia, so I cannot give you more details, but we are trying to see if we can create an initiative from the government that a company, if they donate their surplus food to us, they'll get a tax rebate. So instead of throwing the food away and creating emissions, give that to us, we will give it to people who need it, and we will save the emissions. We will make an impact on net zero. That discussion has been going on for a long time. Hopefully, it will come to fruition. But the reason I say this is because it is, even though we are doing fascinating work on saving emissions, addressing hunger, everybody loves addressing hunger. Okay? Saving emissions, people are not that enthusiastic. It's not as emotional as addressing hunger. But there has to be an infrastructure. There has to be an infrastructure. We need to have government policies that encourage sustainability, that encourage net zero, support organizations like this. Okay, and we are not the only one. There are other people doing work like this. We just happen to be the biggest food bank, but there are other food banks that are doing this work. So we need, if there are any people links to the government, do talk about this. We need this done. We need to start taking small steps to make an impact on net zero. We need a system where carbon credits will be useful. So companies that are actually organizations like us who are making an impact of reducing emissions, we can get credit for that. Okay, so that's just an example of what we can do now. So I'm coming to the kind of end of my time here. So just what are the key lessons here? I would like you to take away at least 3 lessons, and maybe there are more. I strongly believe that we have to think about supply chains and take a supply chain view when we think about emissions. For one, scope 3 emissions are about 75% of all GHG emissions. They are not in control of any one company. So you have to look into the supply chain. At the same time, supply chain infrastructure, the uncertainty about that is what is stopping companies from making investments to achieve net zero by 2050. Okay, so we have to kind of stop thinking about just technology or just my company and start thinking about how do we work in the supply chain, how do we kind of create incentives for the supply chain to be more net zero, to be more sustainable. That's number one. Second, we have to understand that there is a ton of uncertainty in this whole net zero investment space, which is what has stopped companies from making investment or going really starting to make significant, meaningful investments. And we need some way of making decisions that deal with uncertainty like that. So scenario planning is one tool. I'm not saying that's the only tool, but it is a tool that has been used very widely, that has been proven useful, and we have seen scientific evidence that it actually works. Okay, so that's one tool. That tools like that we need to start using. And third, and the last lesson, is there are proven solutions like the Lost Food Project that I shared with you. We are reducing emissions here in Malaysia every single day. But for us, to continue our operations is a struggle because willingness to pay for operational expenses is much lower than willingness to pay for capex. That has to change. We need to start encouraging people like Lost Food Project and others who are doing work to actually save the environment. Now, they're saying that if you work at a charity, maybe you don't need enough money. That's wrong. Charities need people. Charities need really, really smart people, passionate people. And to get those people, we need to pay them well. So we need to have ways of covering operational expenses. And we need support for that. Okay? So this is where companies can, if somebody wants to take meaningful action, they can start doing things about it. So we need to act on funding, but we also need kind of a broader support. Right? We need an infrastructure for trading carbon credits. Hopefully a regulation that will encourage donations, food donations, where companies get tax credit for not throwing the food away and giving it to organizations like the Lost Food Project and so on. So it's overall we need to create this ecosystem that will encourage net zero. So that's all I have to share with you, and we have a question or a comment, so I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Doctor. I have maybe 3 recommendations. One, as we can see from yesterday's and today's discussion, some are very, I would say, government-focused climate initiatives. So we look at YB, Nick Nazmi saying that the government is doing this, doing that. And then we also have industry and finance talking about what they're doing. But remember, there was one question by the lady, how does it flow to the community, to the individual? And I think it was the ambassador of India who rightly said it shouldn't be a whole of government initiative, it should be a whole of nation initiative. So what I'd like to recommend to Atin Datin, our founder, because the Secretary General of Finance had very kindly given the offer, please submit the recommendations during this 3 days event for the Ministry of Finance to look at what are some of the recommendations they could incorporate into budget for October. So maybe what the group can do is to recommend government to shift from, I would say, very restrictive whole of government to whole of nation. And for your good project, it's a community and individual. So they could look at, as you mentioned, tax incentives. And also I'd like to recommend 2 more things. One, because you rightly focus on Kuala Lumpur, because that's where most of the food is available. But we see that KL and Selangor is quite rich. It's more the other states that are quite poor. So maybe you could also extend this. And I see why you are very successful to get support is because you have a beautiful Sultana as a champion. So maybe using this role, you can get more of the Sultana in different states to come on board with the Sultana Selangor being the champion to explain how the ladies can then take a stake and role for climate change using this particular business plan. Then the thirdly is, because you mentioned about going to the markets to get the fresh food, I'm also sometimes very worried because I see when I go to the hotels, they have a lot of food and at the night they're going to throw everything, but we still have very hungry, pengemis and people with homeless who need food. So maybe your next step could be, in addition to the markets, that at night, some of these hotels, instead of throwing the food, you could have your trucks to go and pick up food from them and maybe at a later stage see which are the areas that you have homeless, just to give it to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those 3 fantastic, very, very great suggestions. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Just to the last suggestion about cooked food. So cooked food supply chain is kind of different. There's something that we are working on, but it's not implemented yet. A part of what slows us down is not just having the people and the capacity to do the work, right? So that's why we move on this. But 3 very good recommendations, so thank you. And I'll talk with Dr. Sunita actually and share your suggestion with you. So thank you. Yes.
Thanks for the incredible talk about scenario planning. John, I checked out your profile, so went to Ohio State. Noticed you went there as well. I've got a friend who also graduated from ASB, there's MBA there. My question is actually about, so like when you talk about scenario planning, for example, the oil palm plantation, because oil palm is a crop that lasts for 20 to 25 years, whilst you talk about wheat, that 2 years and then you could do a crop rotation, switch to a different crop after 2 years, so you have that flexibility, you have that inherent inbuilt flexibility. But when it comes to oil palm, once you plant it, you're pretty much stuck. So you can't really do scenario planning for that because the cost is sunk and so forth. So that is one question because when it comes to oil palm. The other question is actually regarding your lost food project that you're running. I came to know that the NGO that is really well funded, they have grant specialists where they apply to the EU, they get probably some millions of euros donated here, and I noticed that their NGO staff, fresh grad, making 3K. I was like surprised. I was like, this is the gold standard for NGOs in Malaysia. I'm wondering about the Lost Food Project, where do you guys have full-time staff that runs the operations, and are they well compensated in that regard? Because sometimes the NGO industry in Malaysia, they are not well compensated, as I do know.
You're absolutely right. People somehow think that charity employees do not need to be paid well, which is completely wrong, right? At Lost Food Project, we really believe, and our founder Suzanne, she is very, very passionate about this, is that we have to pay our people really well. In fact, if we need the top talent, we need to pay the top price for that, right? Because they are the ones who are going to run the charity. So fortunately, our people are paid really well. You do not see any person making 3K, maybe a very, very basic level, but managerial level, staff level, no, they are paid very well. Having said that, we have a staff of about 12 people, okay, plus minus 2. Yeah. But we also work with volunteers, and we have more than, last year we had more than 500 active, 500 volunteers, both private, like individuals like you, and coming to help us, as well as corporate volunteers. And to your point, this is a great example of a community solution, right? So you have a staff of about 10, 12 people who kind of run this organization, and then people like me, so we have about a dozen of us who are on the committee, and then which are also volunteers, and about 500 other volunteers. So there's a real community involvement in this project like this. And the great thing about Malaysia, as far as I know, I'm still a foreigner here, is there's a lot of passion among people. People are really passionate. There's a lot of charitable intent in the community. So we need to leverage that. We really need to have like a whole nation solution, right? We have this, in 2021, the Law School project received tremendous amount of funding. Why? People just donated the money because they realized COVID is a bad time and a lot of people who are going hungry because they cannot leave their home. And the community support that we had in year 2021 was mind-boggling. So in Malaysia, we have that community spirit. But also, all of you know this better than I do. I'm a foreigner. Right? I've lived in this country for only 10 years. You know this better. How can we leverage that? How can we get community involved with government support? There are companies that want to do good work. So we need to come together. And I'm going to say this in self-interest, but one of the best players to bring different group of stakeholders together is actually academia. That's because we don't make money by bringing people together. We are not selling anything. We are an educational institute, but we can be neutral. We also have an interest in being scientific and not just trying to say if something works or not. We take an objective view. So think about communities, government, private sector, academia coming together and creating initiative. And maybe that's where Dr. Sunita's we can give her suggestions, right? So forum like this, the reason I'm coming here and speaking with this is because we can share these ideas and maybe we can really create something meaningful in Malaysia together. So thank you for that question about, I know I digress from it, but we pay our people very well. We have a very small staff, right? We struggle to get money for that, but we work hard. And about the palm oil plantation, yes, once you make an investment, it's kind of a sunk cost, right? So before making that investment, we have to think about multiple scenarios.
Another question. How do you balance that being an associate professor at ESP? I'm sure you're busy teaching, you have to do supervision of master's or PhD students, you're probably authoring some books and authoring some journals, articles on the side, working on consulting projects, and how do you balance that with the Lost Food Project, being president and chairing that and managing the whole operations team? You know, it's juggling, you're wearing many hats and juggling a lot of things, and you juggle too many things at one go, things might fall to pieces. I'm just, hypothetically speaking, right? Since you're talking about scenario planning.
Yeah.
But more to the point, aside from that, because I know that you guys have a warehouse, you guys wholesale food, I was wondering if you guys have thought about expanding into soup kitchens in Malaysia, which I am aware of. There are some in Pasar Seni, there are a few around, but have you thought about, doing like, soup kitchens? The concept came from New York and London where they have soup kitchens for the homeless and so forth. Have you, since you all have the raw materials of the food products, have you thought of working with F&B outlets and then churning those out into, eatable food products, edible food products for that creating like an ecosystem of soup kitchens around you, which I'm sure there is already, but maybe adding more diversity or variety for the community.
So I think we have discussed the ideas, right? We are not doing anything actively about soup kitchen. Having said that, we have donated to Kichara Soup Kitchen, for example, right? They're probably still one of our beneficiaries. I don't know exactly if they are still or not, but we have, definitely. So we have donated to soup kitchens. Cooked food, handling cooked food requires some special equipment, takes extra care, things like that. So we haven't quite gone into it. Not because we cannot do it, but it requires a new set of SOPs and so on. Yeah. So that, and your other question was? Oh, yeah. Well, I'm not the only one, right? So everybody on the committee is like that. If people are busy, but you find something that you're interested in, you're passionate about, you see people doing good work, you just want to be involved in it. So you spend some evening time working on it, some weekend time, and so on. But we all have plenty of time, right? I don't check my WhatsApp every hour or every minute or every 5 minutes. I'm not on Facebook, so maybe I'm saving some time there and spending it on the things that I'm more interested in. But I'm not alone. There are people, so many people doing good work, right? They find time to do this. Okay.
I have just want to share regarding funding. Since many public listed companies do have their foundation, okay, were it not that under the SDG goal, 17 goal, in number 11, sustainability, city and community, and number 17 is about partnership for the goal. Doesn't it's a good approach to approach them using the foundation, so it'll be easier entry. I'm sure foundations, a lot of people, public listed company already run out of idea how to write the sustainability reports. So you will get that. And another question is about decarbonization supply chain. In your opinion, circular value networking, whereby the waste from a person or from one company is transferred to another. So will that actually able to help to decarbonize supply chain?
Yes, so let me answer your second question first. Definitely yes, yeah. And then there are actually business models that look at that. So for example, there are initiatives both in Malaysia but also in other countries. For example, that will take clothing, right? So garment waste is one of the biggest sources of waste, right? Often it ends up in landfill. Right? So they'll take used clothing and then or clothing that is maybe that didn't get sold by especially say some fast fashion kind of companies, and then they'll sell it at a discounted price. So there are initiatives like that. But again, what is common in those initiatives is to take the supply chain view. You look at the whole supply chain and say, okay, what is going to the waste? Oftentimes, really, really good product ends up in the waste. How can you capture that? And how can you create value from it? Yeah, so definitely, yes, answer is yes. To your first question about foundations, you're absolutely right. In fact, we are beneficiaries of a very generous foundation called Yayasan Sime Derby, YSD. And the CEO of Yayasan Sime Derby, Dr. Vidya, she's on our board, and she has been a fantastic supporter, amazing supporter. And YSD does lots of great things. They support initiatives like TLFP, but also like marine conservation and a lot of environmental work. So there are foundations that are doing great work. YSD is one great example of that. At the same time, other foundations, we have worked with them, and sometimes we actually have been hosted by one foundation that will remain nameless. We were actually traveling to a foundation's meeting from KL to a city far away, and on the way we got a call saying that our meeting has been cancelled and our team had to turn back. So that stuff also happens. But no, so those are maybe anomalies. But we have seen that. But at the same time, foundation is definitely a good source, and there are foundations like YSD. They are doing great work in supporting charities like us. Okay, any other questions? Well, if not, then thank you very much for coming, and hopefully it was worth your time, about 2 hours. And I hope, huh? So, okay, I know, I don't think Pune and stocks on that. But do keep in touch. Yeah, send me an email. I'll be happy to exchange ideas with you. And eventually, as I said, right, this is something we need to all do together, like net zero, right? This is all for our future, our kids' future, their kids' future, right? So this is really important. We need to work together as a team. So please get in touch and see what we can do together. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah.